The weight of a promise. Colonel Marcus Reed's boots clicked rhythmically against the gleaming airport terminal floor, the echo of his stride a constant reminder of the journey that had brought him here. The day was bright, the sun pouring down from a sky that seemed indifferent to his heavy heart. It was supposed to be a homecoming, but this wasn't a joyful occasion. This wasn't a celebration of life, but rather the solemn task of laying to rest a fallen brother. The taxi that had dropped him off lingered for a moment before pulling away, its engine fading into the distance. Marcus didn't notice. His mind was focused on the papers in his hand. In his grasp, he held the necessary documents to transport the body of his closest friend, Private First Class Thomas Keller. The journey from overseas had been long, fraught with emotions that Marcus didn't know how to process. But it had to be done. He had promised Thomas, and Marcus wasn't the type of man to break a promise, especially not one made to a fallen comrade. Thomas Keller wasn't just a soldier. He was family. The two had met in basic training, strangers who became fast friends. They'd shared everything from food rations to stories of home. They'd stood side by side through the hell of war, watching each other's backs when it mattered most. And when Thomas had taken a bullet in the chest during a surprise attack overseas, Marcus had vowed that he would be the one to bring him home. Marcus adjusted his uniform, running a hand over his crisp dress jacket, checking the placement of his medals, small but potent symbols of his service and sacrifice. They reflected the harsh sunlight, catching the light in a way that only made him feel heavier. It wasn't the pride he should have felt standing at attention with such honors that weighed on him now. No, it was the grief, the loss of a friend who would never laugh again, never sit down for another meal, never fight alongside him in battle. The airport was busy, passengers hustling past with their own stories, their own concerns, their own lives to live. But to Marcus, the world around him felt as if it had slowed down, suspended in the painful silence of his thoughts. He passed by a family, a father lifting his young daughter up into his arms, and it made Marcus' chest tighten. His thoughts turned to his own family, his wife, his children. How would he explain the pain of war to them? How could he tell them that war had taken someone so dear? At the entrance to the terminal, Marcus paused for a moment. He took a deep breath, fighting the lump that had formed in his throat. This was it. The moment when the weight of duty and loss collided. He had to keep it together, for Thomas. He had promised. A voice broke through his reverie. "Excuse me, sir, can I see your papers?" Marcus turned to see a security officer standing in front of him, holding out her hand expectantly. Marcus felt a flash of irritation surge through him. Didn't she see the uniform? The medals? Didn't she understand what he was here for? But he tamped down the feeling, reminding himself that he had no room for impatience, not when the task ahead was so important. "Of course," he said, his voice controlled but heavy with the weight of everything he was carrying. He handed over the papers for inspection, his gaze never leaving the officer's face. The officer glanced down at the documents, her expression impassive. Marcus could see the faintest flicker of something, disinterest, perhaps, or exhaustion, as she scanned the paperwork. She didn't seem to understand the significance of what was in front of her. To her, it was just another body to process, just another form to check. After what felt like an eternity, she looked up. Her eyes met his for a brief moment before she glanced back down at the papers. "I'm afraid these are not sufficient," she said, her voice cold and matter-of-fact. "You'll need additional clearance to transport this body." Marcus felt his stomach tighten. "What are you talking about?" "These documents were issued by the military. This is for the transport of a fallen soldier." "I understand," the officer replied, but there was no empathy in her tone. "But the paperwork isn't in order. You'll need to go to the main office for further approval." Marcus clenched his jaw. His patience, already worn thin, was now fraying. "You don't understand," he said, his voice low and firm. "This is not just any soldier. This is my best friend. I'm taking him home, where he belongs." The officer raised an eyebrow, seemingly unmoved by the emotional plea. "I'm sorry, sir, but regulations are regulations. You'll need to go through the proper channels." Marcus took a deep breath, fighting the rising frustration. He wanted to shout, to demand that she understand the significance of this, but he knew that would get him nowhere. His mind raced with thoughts of what could go wrong if they didn't move quickly: delays, more paperwork, more time wasted. Time he couldn't afford. He nodded stiffly. "Where's the office?" The officer pointed down the corridor. "Second door on your left." Marcus didn't waste another moment. He turned on his heel and strode down the hallway, the sound of his boots echoing in the silence. Every step felt heavier than the last. The air around him seemed to grow thicker, more suffocating, as he moved toward the office. He could feel the stares of the other passengers, the whispers, the judgments. He knew they were looking at him, sizing him up. And it wasn't just because he wore the uniform. It was because of who he was. Marcus Reed, a black man in a position of power, a soldier who had earned his rank through years of hard work and sacrifice. He had fought for his country, and yet, here he was, being treated like an outsider, like a nobody. Like the life of his friend didn't matter as much as the paperwork. He reached the office door and knocked sharply. A voice inside called out, "Come in." Marcus pushed open the door and stepped inside. The man behind the desk looked up from his papers, his eyes narrowing as he took in Marcus' uniform. There was no recognition in his eyes, no understanding. Just the cold, detached gaze of someone who had no idea what it meant to carry the weight of a fallen comrade. "How can I help you, sir?" the man asked, his tone polite but distant. "I need clearance to transport the body of a fallen soldier," Marcus said, his voice steady but tinged with the frustration he felt. "The documents should be in order." The man glanced at the papers, then back at Marcus. His expression didn't change. "I'll need to verify these documents," he said, barely glancing at the paperwork before placing it aside. Marcus' heart sank. He could feel the weight of time pressing down on him. "Please," he said, his voice strained. "I need to get this done today. This is a matter of honor." The man didn't seem to hear him. Instead, he stood up and walked toward a filing cabinet, muttering to himself as he sifted through papers. Marcus stood there, watching him, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. The minutes dragged by like hours, and with every passing second, Marcus felt the tight grip of anxiety settle deeper within him. All he could think about was Thomas, lying there in that coffin, waiting to be laid to rest, waiting for his final journey home. But with each delay, that journey seemed to grow farther and farther away. A brotherhood tested. The office buzzed with the sound of phones ringing and people chatting in hushed tones. Marcus stood motionless, his thoughts racing faster than the minutes slipping by. His hand instinctively rested on the top of his military-issued duffel bag, where he kept a set of personal belongings, including the photograph of him and Thomas, taken just before they shipped out for deployment. In the photo, both men were laughing, standing side by side with their arms slung over each other's shoulders. It was a snapshot of a friendship that had withstood the worst, and now, it would also be the symbol of the promise Marcus had made. Lieutenant Green remained by his side, his gaze steady, watching the exchange between the officers in the room. Marcus could tell Green wasn't one to waste time on niceties. He was moving with a purpose, ensuring everything was handled without delay. The younger officer's respect for Marcus was evident, but Marcus knew it ran deeper than just a shared military history. Green understood the weight of what he was carrying, not just the body of a fallen soldier, but the responsibility of delivering that soldier home. The officer behind the desk, who had initially seemed detached, hung up the phone and turned toward them with a serious expression. "You're cleared to go, Colonel," he said, his tone much more respectful than it had been earlier. "Sorry about the confusion. You should have been processed already, but it looks like everything is in order now. They'll escort you to the plane. Marcus nodded, trying to hold himself together. He felt the floodgates of emotion begin to crack open, threatening to spill out all the grief he had been holding in. He had been so focused on the mission, the logistics, the delays, the protocols, that he hadn't allowed himself to feel what was happening. Now, with the approval finally given, the enormity of the moment started to hit him. Green patted him on the back, offering a small but reassuring smile. "I've got your back, Marcus. Let's get your friend home." Without another word, Green led Marcus through the hallways of the airport, past the bustling crowds, toward the secured gate where the cargo plane awaited. The last stretch of the journey was in sight, but Marcus could feel his chest tightening. He was used to the chaos of battle, to the noise of gunfire and explosions, but this was different. This was about honor. This was about laying a brother in arms to rest. And it wasn't just any soldier. It was Thomas Keller. As they neared the gate, Marcus noticed the armed military personnel standing guard, their expressions stern but respectful. It was clear they were here to protect the fallen soldier, but there was something else in the air, something unspoken. The weight of the situation wasn't lost on them either. They understood. These were men who had, no doubt, experienced the same bonds of camaraderie and loss that Marcus had. And now, they too were part of this journey. The moment they approached the military transport, a sergeant stepped forward, holding out his hand in a formal salute. "Colonel Reed, I'm Sergeant Mitchell. We'll take it from here." Marcus returned the salute, his throat tight. "Thank you, Sergeant. I appreciate it." The sergeant nodded, gesturing for them to follow him. "We've made all the arrangements for transport. The remains are secured in the cargo hold. Everything's ready to go." Marcus nodded, following the sergeant up the ramp and onto the plane. The interior was stark, functional, nothing like the luxury of commercial airliners. This was a no-frills military transport, designed for one purpose, to get soldiers and their belongings where they needed to be. He couldn't help but feel the contrast between this place and the place he'd left behind, the warm homes of families reunited, the distant sounds of laughter and chatter in the terminal. Those sounds felt miles away now. The coffin, draped in the American flag, sat solemnly in the center of the cargo hold. It was the most striking thing in the room, and in that moment, Marcus could barely bring himself to look at it. The reality of what he was about to do, of what he had already done, was setting in. Thomas wasn't coming back. He wasn't going to be there to joke about the war stories they'd tell when they got home. He wasn't going to be there for Marcus to lean on in the hard times. Thomas was gone. And it was up to Marcus to carry his memory. But the burden was more than just personal. It was familial. The Keller family was waiting for their son, their brother, their friend. And Marcus had promised them he would bring Thomas home. As the plane's engines began to hum to life, signaling that they were ready to take off, Marcus took one last look around the cargo hold. The room felt smaller now, more confined. The noise of the engines seemed to echo louder in his head. The weight of his duty, the promise he had made, felt like it was pressing down on him from all sides. Lieutenant Green took a seat next to him, his face etched with concern. "How are you holding up?" he asked quietly. Marcus exhaled slowly, his hands gripping the edge of his seat. "I'm doing all right," he replied, though he knew the answer didn't quite capture everything he was feeling. It's hard, you know. You think you're ready, but when it comes down to it, you never are. I'm bringing him home, Green. But it doesn't feel like enough." Green nodded, his expression understanding. "I know it doesn't. But you're doing what you can. And that's all any of us can do." Marcus looked at him, a small but grateful smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "Thanks, Green. I couldn't do this without you." The flight was quiet for most of the journey. The hours seemed to blend together as the plane flew steadily toward its destination. There was no time for rest, no time to let the emotions fully settle. Every minute was another moment closer to home, to the final chapter in this journey. As they neared the airstrip near the town where Thomas had grown up, Marcus couldn't help but think back to the last time he had been there. It had been before the war, before everything had changed. Thomas had taken him to his small town for a weekend pass, introducing him to his family and friends. They had laughed, eaten too much food, and talked about the future, what they would do once the war was over, where they would go, what they would become. But none of those promises had come to pass. Now, Thomas was gone. And Marcus had to do what he had promised, bring him back to the place where it had all started, to the people who loved him. As the plane descended toward the small airstrip, Marcus felt the weight of everything on his shoulders. This was the moment when his duty would be fulfilled. But it wasn't the end of the story. Not by a long shot. The plane touched down gently, its wheels skimming over the runway with a soft thud. Marcus didn't move immediately. He sat there for a moment, his eyes fixed on the coffin that would soon be unloaded, his heart heavy with the knowledge that this was only the beginning of the emotional journey that lay ahead. The funeral, the memorials, the goodbyes, they were all part of it. And in that moment, Marcus knew that the hardest part of this journey was yet to come. The back ramp of the plane slowly lowered, and Marcus stood, ready to see this final chapter through. He stepped out into the cold air, the familiar sounds of the small town filling his ears as he walked toward the awaiting transport. The weight of duty was still there, still pressing down on him, but now, it was joined by something else, a sense of purpose. A sense that this was what he had been trained for, what he had been prepared to face. The final resting place. The chill of the early morning air hit Marcus as soon as the plane's back ramp lowered, and the gentle breeze stirred the dust of the airstrip. He took a deep breath, letting the sharpness of the air clear his mind, if only for a moment. There was something about the quiet, something almost sacred, as the small town of Oak Ridge unfolded before him. Its familiar surroundings, though now tinged with the weight of his mission, were almost a comfort. This was the place Thomas had called home, and Marcus would see to it that his friend was laid to rest here, where he belonged. Sergeant Mitchell, who had accompanied the body back from the airport, stepped forward. He gave Marcus a brief nod of respect before turning to the military personnel who had already begun to unload the coffin. The flag draped over the casket fluttered slightly in the breeze, and Marcus' heart squeezed. It was a reminder of the honor that would be carried in the final moments of his friend's journey. "I'll take it from here, Colonel," Mitchell said. His voice was soft, but steady, understanding the weight of the moment. "We've got the funeral detail waiting at the cemetery. You're good to go." Marcus nodded, though a part of him wasn't quite ready to let go of the responsibility. He had promised Thomas's family that he would see this through, that he would ensure the man who had been his closest ally, who had sacrificed everything for their shared mission, would be honored in the way he deserved. As the military personnel loaded the coffin onto the waiting hearse, Marcus walked alongside them, his footsteps steady but heavy, his thoughts clouded by the events that had led him here. He couldn't help but replay the moments in his mind, the way he had seen Thomas fall, the blood staining the ground beneath him, and the helplessness he had felt in that instant. "Thomas," Marcus whispered softly to himself, his voice barely audible over the sounds of the engine starting up, "I promised you, brother." Lieutenant Green, who had followed him off the plane, was quiet, his face set in a mask of respect. But Marcus could see the quiet sympathy in his eyes. Green had never known Thomas the way Marcus had, but he understood loss. He had seen it too many times. They all had. As they made their way toward the cemetery, the town of Oak Ridge seemed to grow quieter, as if the earth itself was holding its breath. Marcus recognized a few faces along the way, neighbors, families, and friends of Thomas. It seemed like everyone was waiting for something. Waiting for closure. Waiting for answers. Waiting for something that could never truly be fixed. The cemetery was just outside of town, nestled on the outskirts where the land met the rolling hills. It was a small, peaceful place, with graves lined up in neat rows, each headstone a testament to the lives of those who had come before. The place was both tranquil and solemn, the kind of place where memories lingered in the air like a quiet whisper. As they pulled up to the cemetery gates, Marcus could already see the funeral details in place, rows of military personnel standing at attention, their crisp uniforms reflecting the dignity of the occasion. A crowd had gathered, and Marcus could see a few familiar faces. Thomas's parents were there, standing near the front, their grief palpable even from a distance. Mrs. Keller's hand was clutched tightly around her husband's arm, her eyes red-rimmed, her expression a mix of sorrow and disbelief. It was the kind of grief no mother should ever have to experience, the kind of pain that left a permanent mark on the soul. Marcus' chest tightened as he saw the Kellers. He had known them, had shared countless conversations with them about their son, about their hopes for the future. Now, that future was gone, stolen away by the cruel hand of war. He walked toward them, his heart heavy with the knowledge that there was nothing he could do to ease their pain, nothing he could say to take away their sorrow. But there was something he had to do, something that might bring them a sense of peace, if only for a moment. "Mr. and Mrs. Keller," Marcus said, his voice low and steady, "I'm so sorry for your loss. I promised Thomas the First would bring him back to you. He's home now." Mr. Keller looked at Marcus, his face a mask of grief. He extended his hand, and Marcus took it firmly. "Thank you, Colonel," he said softly. "Thank you for keeping your word. I know my son would have wanted this, wanted you to be here." Marcus swallowed hard, his throat tight with emotion. "Thomas was more than a soldier. He was my friend. My brother. I couldn't have made it through without him." Mrs. Keller stepped forward then, her eyes wet with tears. She embraced Marcus tightly, her grip strong despite the sadness that seemed to swallow her whole. "Thank you," she whispered, "for bringing him back." Marcus nodded, though the lump in his throat made it difficult to speak. All he could do was hold her for a moment, offering the silent comfort of knowing her son had been loved, that he had mattered. As the ceremony began, the military personnel stood in perfect formation, their faces stoic and respectful. The sound of a bugle filled the air, its mournful notes drifting across the cemetery, signaling the start of the final goodbye. The American flag was carefully folded, its stars and stripes now a symbol of the debt owed to the fallen soldier, the man who had given everything in service to his country. The crowd fell into a respectful silence, and Marcus stood tall, his back straight, his posture rigid. But inside, he was struggling to hold himself together. Every part of him ached with the weight of the loss, the emptiness of standing there knowing that his friend was no longer with him. The service was brief but poignant. Words of remembrance were spoken by the chaplain, prayers were said, and Thomas Keller was finally laid to rest, his body carefully lowered into the ground. The earth swallowed the casket, sealing the final chapter of a life that had been full of promise but cut short too soon. As the last shovels of dirt were tossed into the grave, Marcus couldn't help but look up at the sky. It was a bright day, the sun shining through the few clouds that had begun to gather. It was the kind of day where the world felt alive and full of possibilities. But Marcus knew that for the Kellers, for everyone who had known Thomas, this would never be a normal day again. He stood by the grave for a long while, watching as the rest of the mourners made their way up to pay their respects. The flags fluttered in the breeze, the faint scent of fresh flowers filling the air. But none of it seemed to matter. None of it could fill the hole that Thomas's absence had left behind. And yet, as Marcus stood there, something inside him began to shift. It wasn't an instant thing. It wasn't a moment of clarity or epiphany. But there, standing next to the gravesite of his brother, Marcus realized that the pain he felt would never truly go away. The grief, the emptiness, it would remain with him, as it would for all those who had lost someone they loved. But he also realized that Thomas's life, his sacrifice, had meant something. It had been part of something greater than just them. It had been a part of a story much bigger than either of them could have imagined. As the ceremony concluded, Marcus turned to walk away, his steps slow but steady. He knew what came next, what would follow in the weeks and months ahead. There would be more funerals, more goodbyes. There would be the long, painful process of healing, of learning to live without those who had meant so much. But he also knew that the promise he had made to Thomas was fulfilled. And as long as he remembered his friend, as long as he carried Thomas's memory with him, the brotherhood they had shared would never truly be broken. Echoes of a war, silence of a life. The days after Thomas Keller's funeral felt like a blur to Marcus. The steady march of time seemed to lose meaning, as though the world had settled into an indefinite pause. He had always been accustomed to the rhythms of military life, the structure, the deadlines, the missions. But now, in the quiet that followed the burial, it felt like the world had shifted beneath him, pulling him into a space where his actions were no longer measured by duty alone, but by the weight of memory, grief, and the questions that lingered in the silence. Marcus had returned to Oak Ridge only a few days after the funeral, his presence lingering like a shadow among the people who had known Thomas for so much longer than he had. He found himself in the same small town, where the houses were lined up neatly along quiet streets, and the vast, open fields stretched endlessly in every direction. It was the kind of place that seemed untouched by the world's chaos, safe, sheltered, and serene. It was also the kind of place that now felt unbearably small, as if every corner reminded Marcus that something essential was missing, that there was a void where his friend should have been. He spent the days with Thomas's family, helping with whatever they needed. Mrs. Keller had taken to staying in her room more often than not, only coming down for meals, her grief deepening with every passing day. Mr. Keller seemed lost, a man adrift in a sea of sorrow, his once sturdy shoulders hunched in a way that seemed foreign to Marcus. It was clear that Thomas had been the light in their lives, the person who had brought joy and laughter into their quiet home. Now, there was only the lingering absence. Marcus had always prided himself on his ability to stay strong in the face of adversity. But here, in the quiet of the Keller household, he realized how little he knew about grief. It wasn't the kind of thing that could be measured in tangible ways, the kind of thing you could fight against or outrun. It seeped into your bones, filling up every corner of your mind until there was nothing left but the sorrow. He had thought he understood loss, had believed that his years of military service had prepared him for the emotional toll of war. But now, standing alongside the Kellers, he realized that no amount of training could prepare anyone for the finality of death, the emptiness that followed a person's absence. It was early one evening, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, that Marcus found himself walking along the dirt road that led to the small chapel near the edge of town. He had often walked this road with Thomas, the two of them laughing and talking about their future, about the places they would go once the war was over. But now, with Thomas gone, the road felt different. Every step felt weighted, as though the earth beneath his feet knew what he was carrying, knew the burden that had settled into his chest. As Marcus approached the chapel, he spotted someone sitting on the steps, silhouetted against the setting sun. It was Thomas's younger sister, Olivia, her back to him as she stared out at the horizon. Olivia had always been close to Thomas, and Marcus could tell that the weight of her brother's loss was hitting her hard. She had been quiet at the funeral, her tears few but her sorrow deep, like the still waters of a lake just before a storm. Marcus hesitated for a moment, unsure if she wanted company. But as he got closer, she turned, and her eyes met his, eyes that were wide with emotion, yet seemed distant, as though she were lost in a world of her own grief. Her face softened when she saw him, but it was the kind of softness that came from understanding the weight of loss, the kind that didn't need words. "Colonel," she said quietly, standing up as if she hadn't expected anyone to be there. "Olivia," Marcus replied, his voice low but steady. "I didn't mean to intrude. I just thought. I don't know." I thought I could use some air. She nodded, her eyes dropping to the ground for a moment before looking back up at him. I understand. It feels like everything's on pause, doesn't it? Like the world keeps moving, but we're stuck here, waiting for something to change, to make sense of it. Marcus studied her face, seeing in her eyes the same confusion, the same helplessness that had settled in his heart. He hadn't known Olivia as well as he had known Thomas, but he could see that she was carrying a deep grief, a grief that Marcus didn't know how to alleviate. I never thought I'd be here like this, she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. I thought he'd come home, safe. We all did. But now it's just empty. Every room, every corner of this house feels empty without him. Marcus sat beside her, not saying anything at first. The words seemed too heavy, too loaded with meaning to say aloud. But he knew he couldn't stay silent forever. I know it doesn't make sense, he said finally. You know, when I first got to Oak Ridge, I thought I would be able to help. I thought I could be strong for everyone, because that's what I've been trained to do. But it doesn't work like that. Grief, it doesn't care about training. It doesn't care about strength. Olivia glanced at him, her gaze sharp but soft. You didn't fail him, Colonel. You did what you promised. You brought him back. The words hung between them for a moment, the weight of them sinking in. Marcus felt a wave of emotion surge through him, threatening to overwhelm him. I promised him, he whispered, his voice cracking. I promised him I would bring him home. But it feels like I've failed him somehow. Like I can't do enough. Olivia placed a hand on his arm, her touch gentle but strong. You didn't fail him. You kept your word. But even that, it doesn't make the pain go away. Marcus swallowed hard, his chest tightening. No, he agreed. It doesn't make it go away. But we keep going, right? That's all we can do. We keep moving, keep remembering. She nodded slowly, a small smile tugging at the corners of her lips. I don't know how I'm supposed to move on without him. I feel like a part of me is missing. Marcus understood. He had felt the same way ever since the day Thomas fell, the day he had lost a part of himself. He had always known that war came with a price, but he had never imagined the cost would be this high. He had never imagined he would be the one to have to carry this weight. Maybe we don't have to move on, Marcus said, his voice thoughtful. Maybe we just learn to live with it. We remember them, the good times, the laughter. And we make sure their memory lives on in everything we do. Olivia was silent for a moment, the soft breeze rustling the trees around them. Finally, she spoke again, her voice steady. I think I can live with that. Marcus nodded. Me too. They sat together in silence for a while, watching as the sun set over the fields, the sky painted in shades of orange and purple. The weight of their shared grief didn't disappear, but in that moment, it felt a little lighter. And as the darkness began to settle over Oak Ridge, Marcus knew that this was not the end of his journey. This was just the beginning. There would be days when the grief would return, when the memories would overwhelm him. But there would also be moments like this one, moments where the silence between them wasn't one of despair, but of understanding. The quiet aftermath. The next few days in Oak Ridge were slow, like the stretching of a long, heavy silence. Marcus had planned to leave after the funeral, to return to his post and get back to the rhythm of his responsibilities. But something held him there. Something inside him, some unspoken promise, perhaps, demanded that he stay a little longer. It wasn't for the Kellers, though he owed them everything for the warmth and care they had shown him in those dark days. It wasn't for the town either, despite the quiet comfort that the small, serene place provided. No, Marcus stayed for himself. He stayed to continue the process of healing, to allow the aching, gnawing grief to have its space, and to find the path through it. He spent his mornings walking around Oak Ridge, retracing old paths he had once walked with Thomas. It felt odd, almost surreal, to be there without his friend at his side, his laughter and easy conversation filling the air. The mornings were especially difficult, too quiet, too still. Marcus had never been one to shy away from solitude, but now, every moment felt like a weight, a reminder that his life had shifted in a way he couldn't easily explain. He had been trained to handle the worst of war, to deal with the chaos, the violence, and the ever-present danger. But nothing could have prepared him for the emptiness that followed the loss of a close friend. By mid-morning, he often found himself at the small cafe in the heart of town, sitting at a corner table with a coffee in hand, watching the people come and go. The cafe was a gathering place for the residents of Oak Ridge, a warm and inviting spot where the smells of freshly brewed coffee and baked goods hung in the air. It was where he had first met Thomas's parents, where they had discussed their son's hopes and dreams before he had shipped off to war. Now, the same place felt like a ghost town, its energy dampened by the shadow of grief that had settled over it. The same faces came in, but there was a quietness in their eyes, a sense of loss that no words could convey. It was during one of these visits that Marcus noticed an unfamiliar face in the corner. A young man, probably in his mid-20s, with dark, curly hair and an air of quiet melancholy that made him stand out in the otherwise familiar setting. The man seemed deep in thought, staring at the coffee in front of him as if it held the answers to a question he couldn't quite ask. There was something about him that made Marcus feel drawn to him, though he couldn't explain why. He hesitated at first, unsure if the man would welcome his company, but something pushed him forward. Perhaps it was the weight of the town's silence, or perhaps it was his own need for connection in this time of emotional solitude. Whatever the reason, Marcus stood up and walked over to the table. "Mind if I join you?" Marcus asked, his voice carrying a slight edge of politeness that he hoped didn't sound intrusive. The man looked up, his eyes narrowing for a moment before recognition flickered in them. "Colonel Reed," he said, his tone soft but respectful. "I didn't expect to see you here." Marcus smiled, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "I guess I've become something of a regular around here," he replied, gesturing to the empty chair across from the man. "Mind if I sit?" The man nodded, shifting slightly to make room. "Not at all. It's good to see someone around here who knows what they're doing." Marcus took a seat, studying the young man across from him. He was wearing a simple, well-worn jacket and had the look of someone who had seen hardship, someone who carried a weight much too heavy for someone so young. "I don't believe we've met," Marcus said after a brief pause. "Are you from around here?" The man hesitated for a moment before answering. "I'm not from Oak Ridge originally," he said. "But I've been here for a while now, visiting some family. I don't think we've crossed paths before." Marcus studied him for a moment longer, sensing that there was something more the man wasn't saying, something he was keeping hidden. There was a quiet sadness in his eyes, a depth of emotion that Marcus recognized all too well. The young man wasn't just a traveler, he was someone who had experienced loss, the kind of loss that left you feeling hollow, unable to escape the weight of memories that hung on you like chains. "I'm sorry," Marcus said, his voice softer now. "You look like you've got a lot on your mind." The young man let out a short, bitter laugh. "You could say that," he replied. "I guess you could say I've seen my fair share of things. You'd think I'd be used to it by now, but—" Marcus nodded, understanding without needing to hear more. "Loss doesn't get easier," he said. "It doesn't matter how many times you've faced it, how many times you've seen it. It always feels like the first time." The man looked at him then, his eyes searching Marcus' face as if trying to gauge whether or not he could trust him. After a few moments, he spoke again, his voice quieter. "I lost my brother," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "He was supposed to come back, just like your friend. But he didn't. And I've been trying to make sense of it ever since. But I can't. Not really." Marcus' chest tightened at the mention of the young man's brother. He had heard the story before, had lived it in his own way, and he could feel the rawness of the man's words in his bones. "I understand," Marcus said quietly, his voice low but steady. "It's hard. And no matter how much time passes, you can't stop missing them. You can't stop feeling the void they leave behind." The young man nodded, his eyes distant. "It's been almost a year now. And yet, it feels like I'm still waiting for him to come back. I keep expecting to see him walk through the door, like everything will go back to normal. But it never does." The pain in his voice was unmistakable, and Marcus could see that the man, despite his youth, was carrying the weight of grief that many never had to face until much later in life. "It's okay to feel that way," Marcus said gently. "You're not alone in that. Grief doesn't follow a timeline. It doesn't care about the rules we set for ourselves. It is what it is." The young man looked at Marcus, his expression unreadable for a moment, before a faint flicker of something passed over his face. "Do you ever feel like you're lost in it? Like you don't know who you are anymore, because they're gone?" Marcus stared at him for a long while, the question hanging in the air between them. He thought about it, about the years of service, the weight of the uniforms, the medals, the duties, the promises kept, but also about the parts of himself that had been lost along the way. He thought about Thomas, about the brother he had lost, and about the emptiness that had settled inside of him in his absence. "Yeah," Marcus said softly, "I do. I feel that way a lot, especially now. But I think we keep going. We find our way through it. We carry them with us, in our own way, in the things we do, in the choices we make. It's the only way to keep moving forward." The young man nodded, his eyes still distant but a flicker of understanding in them. "Maybe that's true," he said. "I just wish I knew how to do it. How to live without him." Marcus gave a small, understanding smile. "It's not easy. It's never easy. But you will. You'll find your way." They sat in silence for a while, the weight of their shared grief hanging between them, the quiet stretching out like a deep, unspoken bond. Marcus knew that, though their stories were different, they were both fighting the same battle. A battle against the emptiness, against the echoes of the past. And, for the first time in days, Marcus felt a sense of peace in that shared silence. They didn't need to speak any further. They had both said enough. As the sun began to set outside the cafe window, casting long shadows across the floor, Marcus realized that sometimes healing didn't come in grand gestures or epiphanies. Sometimes, it came in quiet moments with strangers, in the shared understanding of loss and the slow, steady process of learning how to live with it. The weight of remembering. Weeks passed since Marcus had sat in that quiet cafe with the young man, whose name he had learned was Ethan. Their brief conversation had, in a strange way, marked a turning point for Marcus. It wasn't that the grief had suddenly disappeared or that the pain of losing Thomas had lessened, far from it. But there had been a subtle shift, a recognition that perhaps healing wasn't just about moving forward, but about learning to carry the weight of loss in a way that didn't suffocate you. After that day, Marcus found himself seeking out moments of connection. It wasn't easy. He was a man who had always been self-reliant, someone who had prided himself on his ability to navigate the toughest situations alone. But Thomas's death had shaken him to his core, and in that quiet, insular town, he found himself more open to others than he had ever been before. Olivia, Thomas's younger sister, had continued to lean on him for support. She had become more vocal about her grief, her raw emotions spilling out in waves whenever they would talk. There were moments when she seemed almost lost, overwhelmed by the enormity of her brother's absence. But there were other moments, too, moments when Marcus saw a glimmer of the woman she was becoming. She wasn't just Thomas's sister, she was her own person, learning how to navigate a world without her brother in it. Despite the heavy air that hung over Oak Ridge, there were signs of life, small sparks of light amidst the darkness. In the evenings, the townspeople would gather at the local park for impromptu barbecues, sharing meals, stories, and quiet laughter. Marcus had begun to find solace in these gatherings. They weren't grand or particularly meaningful, but they provided something he hadn't realized he was missing: normalcy. A sense that life, though scarred by loss, could still have moments of beauty and light. Still, the town's sorrow was palpable. It hung in the streets, in the whispers of neighbors who spoke of the Keller family, in the way people paused when they saw Marcus, their faces filled with quiet respect and sympathy. No one in Oakridge had escaped the shadow of war. Even the younger generation, those who hadn't seen combat firsthand, carried the weight of the loss of a brother, a cousin, a friend who had gone to fight for something greater, only to never return. One crisp autumn morning, Marcus found himself standing at the edge of the small cemetery once more. It had become a place of quiet reflection for him, a space where he could feel close to Thomas without the heaviness of a formal gathering, without the crowd, the speeches, the mourning. It was just him and the earth, the grave markers, and the quiet hum of the world turning around him. Today, however, there was a different energy in the air. A group of people had gathered in the cemetery, some of them dressed in their Sunday best, others in casual clothes, all with their heads bent in thought. Marcus recognized a few faces, neighbors, some of Thomas's old friends from high school, people who had watched him grow up in this small town. The funeral had been weeks ago, but this gathering felt different. It wasn't a moment of grief, it felt like a moment of remembrance, a time for the town to come together and honor the man who had meant so much to them. It was the first time Marcus had seen the Kellers in public since the funeral. Thomas's parents had retreated into the sanctuary of their home, still processing their grief in their own way. But today, they were standing together, their backs straight, their faces a mix of somber pride and sorrow. Mrs. Keller's arm was wrapped around her husband's, and together, they stood at the foot of their son's grave, their gazes fixed on the small gathering of people who had come to pay their respects. Marcus walked toward them slowly, his footsteps almost hesitant. He hadn't wanted to intrude on their moment, but something inside him urged him to approach. "Mr. and Mrs. Keller," Marcus said quietly, his voice respectful. "I'm glad to see so many people here." Mr. Keller turned to him, his expression softer than it had been in weeks. There was a weariness in his eyes, but also something else, something Marcus couldn't quite name, but that felt almost like acceptance. "It's good to see you too, Colonel," Mr. Keller replied, his voice rough from days of grief. "We've been keeping to ourselves for the most part, but today we wanted to give Thomas the tribute he deserved. He was a part of this community. And it's time we remind everyone of that." Mrs. Keller nodded, her hand squeezing her husband's arm. She looked at Marcus, her eyes filled with a quiet gratitude. "Thank you for everything you did for him. For being there when we couldn't." The words hit Marcus harder than he expected. He had never wanted thanks, not for this. Not for keeping a promise he'd made to a brother. "I only did what I promised," he said softly. Thomas was family. And family doesn't walk away when things get hard. There was a long pause, the three of them standing in silence, listening to the soft rustle of the leaves in the wind. Finally, Mrs. Keller spoke again, her voice trembling but firm. "I've been thinking a lot about Thomas lately, about everything he wanted in life. He was always so full of hope, so full of plans. He wanted to come home, to start a family, to live a full life. He talked about it all the time." Marcus nodded. He had heard those same dreams spoken so many times by Thomas, dreams of a future that now felt impossibly distant. "He would have made a great father," Marcus said, the words slipping from his mouth before he could stop them. Mrs. Keller's eyes softened. "I always thought so too." There was a quiet moment before Mr. Keller spoke again. "Do you remember the day he enlisted? It was right after high school graduation. He came to us with that look in his eyes, like he'd already made up his mind, like nothing was going to stop him. He let out a soft, almost inaudible laugh, the sound hollow with nostalgia. We tried to talk him out of it. We told him he could do anything he wanted, he didn't have to go to war. But you know how he was. Once his mind was made up, there was no changing it. Marcus smiled faintly at the memory. He remembered it well, the passion in Thomas's eyes when he talked about serving, about making a difference. The certainty with which he spoke of his future, of the things he would accomplish. And Marcus had believed him, believed that they would both return home to pick up the pieces of their lives, to find a way to live the dreams they had set aside in favor of duty. He was a man who knew what he wanted, Marcus said, his voice thick with emotion. And he didn't back down from it. That's something I'll always admire about him. The wind picked up a little, rustling the leaves around them, and for a moment, it felt like Thomas was still there, a part of the air, a part of the world they inhabited. It wasn't a moment of closure, not in the way people might expect. It wasn't a perfect ending to a painful chapter. But it was a moment of remembrance, of honoring the man Thomas had been and the life he had lived. As the group gathered around, they spoke of Thomas, his laughter, his kindness, his dreams, and Marcus found himself feeling something he hadn't felt in a long time, peace. The grief would always be there. It would always sit in the back of his mind, a quiet presence in his life. But in that moment, standing in the cemetery surrounded by people who had loved Thomas as much as he had, Marcus understood that it wasn't just the pain that mattered. It was the love, the memories, the way people came together to keep someone's spirit alive, even after they were gone. The weight of loss would never truly leave him, but it didn't have to. Marcus had learned, through these difficult weeks, that there was strength in remembering. In carrying the weight of those we've lost, and using it to fuel the lives we continue to live.